Welcome to Capitol Hill. Well, it's something of a rarity in federal politics at the moment, but this week has been relatively quiet. Maybe a return to politics as it used to be. There were a few people, though, helping the meter tick over today. One of those was the Shadow Communications Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, who gave a speech to the National Press Club on the Coalition's plans for broadband, and he had some answers to questions on other topics. Also in the news, the Supreme Court has frozen a trust into which the proceeds from the book written by David Hicks on his experience in Guantanamo Bay. To discuss the day's events, we've been joined by Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg and Independent MP Andrew Wilke. Welcome to you both.
Hi Lyndal, hi Andrew.
Josh, if I could start with you on the NBN. Mr Turnbull's made it clear the Coalition's not about destroying the national broadband network, more about refashioning it to make it more competitive and cheaper. You don't yet know how much it will cost because you don't know what you will be left with. Is that the case?
Yeah, look, I think what Malcolm Turnbull has made very clear today is that the government in Australia is the only government in the world that's creating a national monopoly that's government-owned for telecommunications, and it's ripping up competing infrastructure, and it's betting on one form of technology. This is not what we think is best for Australia. And the other key point here is the government's NBN rollout today has been has been farcical. It started off before the election in 2007 as a $4 billion government investment. Now it's a $50 billion government investment under the NBN's own corporate plan. They estimated that more than 35,000 homes would now be provided with the technology. Less than 1,000 have it today, and I think Malcolm Turnbull said in his speech only a handful on the mainland. There's been cost blowouts, there's been problems with infrastructure, problems with the tender process, and I think it's been farcical. So we really don't know what we'll be left with, hopefully when we win government at the next election.
Andrew, you've been supportive of the government's national broadband network, but if the Coalition offers something that is cheaper, that has more competition and that does reasonably the same job, would you be prepared to have a look at that?
No, Lyndal. Look, I've got a lot of respect for Malcolm Turnbull, but I think he's wrong on this one. I do remain supportive of the NBN. I think it's a superior technology. I mean, let's face it, copper wire does seem to have realised all of its potential. There are a lot of inadequacies in wireless technologies at the moment, with an uncertain growth pattern on that, whereas fibre, it has enormous potential already, or enormous capacity already, and enormous potential to grow. I mean, there's no limit to the number of times you can split a ray of light. I think it's a better technology, and I think it'll deliver a better product to Australian consumers. And I do think that in this case, it is sensible for a government monopoly to roll it out. That is not the case always, but I think in this case it is. Let's face it, private enterprise has been left to roll out the net so far in Australia, and even here in my own electorate, which is a capital city electorate, we have woeful internet capabilities, and that's because it's been left to private enterprise. And that's the problem with leaving it to private enterprise. They'll do a fabulous job where there's areas of high demand and they can make good money, but they cannot be counted on to handle the areas of low demand, particularly in rural and regional Australia.
Josh,
but Andrew would have to, Lyndal, kind of say, Andrew would have to agree though that even the process to date has been flawed, and that there's been big cost blowouts, that government timetables have changed, and that the number of people who have actually benefited from the services are far, far less than has actually been promised.
Look, Josh, you're right. We can always do things better, and of course there's been a few hiccups to get to this stage. But let's not forget, this is an enormously ambitious, high-technology project. It's being done on a scale that I don't think has been done anywhere in the world. It's inevitable. There will be some stumbles and there'll be things we can do better. But I think the essence of it remains sound. I think it's a good technology. I think it should be with a government monopoly. I think the big price of it, we'll look back on it one day and think that was a fair price to pay for what is genuinely national strategic infrastructure, and it's nation-changing infrastructure, particularly for people in regional Australia, like my electorate, and rural Australia. And, you know, we might have been moving a little quicker if the opposition hadn't taken every opportunity to try and block it in the Parliament. I make the point again, I've got a lot of respect for Malcolm Turnbull, but I think he's barking up the wrong tree on this one.
If I could move on, Mr Turnbull was unsurprisingly asked questions on other topics, and he did have some responses. Andrew, he told the Press Club that elections are won at the centre, that the way to win is by getting people who normally vote for the other side to vote for you, something he says he's done in his electorate. Do you think Tony Abbott has broad appeal, has appeal in the centre, and do you think, particularly from the opinion polls, that they show he is winning over more than just the people who normally vote for the coalition?
Well, the coalition is clearly miles ahead in opinion polls. The numbers for the government at the moment are dreadful. They're clearly in a hole. But I don't know that means the end of this government. You know, if the Prime Minister gets 2 more years, and I think she will, I think she's got more than enough time to turn this around. Very telling, when I was out in the electorate some days ago, I was taking some soundings, and I ran across one person in a cafe who said, you know, they hate the prospect of a carbon tax, hate it, but they could never bring themselves to vote for Tony Abbott. So, you know, at the end of the day, when people's pens are hovering over a piece of paper, it remains to be seen whether they can bring themselves to vote for Tony Abbott, assuming he is the opposition leader come the next election.
Josh, do you think that Tony Abbott is already winning over the centre, and do you think maybe his capacity to do so is a little bit underrated?
Absolutely. I think he's been fantastic in the leadership role, and his performance has been beyond probably his own expectations even, and that has been shown out in the polls. And I think, you know, this government is in terminal decline, and the reason for that is twofold. One, there's a massive credibility gap on their side. The Prime Minister went to the last election saying there'd be no carbon tax under the government that she leads. She has said that she will stop the boats, and none of that has actually happened. As well as that, the cost of living has gone up, and we've seen the other big problem, which is the implementation of government policies has been, you know, failure after failure, whether it's the pink pads or whether it be...
Will the test, though, for your side be when you start rolling out really a great mass of your own policy?
Well, we already are rolling out some of our own policies, and I'll just give you one example, which I'm very proud of, is mental health. Whereas we announced a $1.5 billion package, we shamed the government into action. Their action wasn't even as good as ours, but the point is they only moved because we moved, and there are lots of other areas where this is happening too. So, you know, Tony Abbott's doing a good job in telling the government, in telling the public, why we would be different to the government on the key issues like the mining tax and the carbon tax, but also rolling out some positive policies as well.
If I could ask you both briefly for your response to the Supreme Court freezing the assets of the trust into which the profits of David Hicks' book are going. Andrew Wilke, should it come as any surprise to Mr Hicks that this action has been taken ahead of the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions launching action to seize all the money from the sales of the book?
Well, Lyndal, before I answer that, can I actually just agree with Josh on something? I think the opposition is miles ahead of the government on mental health policy, and I applauded the opposition's policy at the time of the election, and I continue to applaud it. And although the government has gone some way to rectify that in the subsequent budget, I do think the opposition is travelling much better in that regard. In regard to David Hicks, look. I don't agree with the government going after the proceeds of the book. You know, there is a question mark over his guilt. I mean, sure, he was probably up to no good in Afghanistan, but he was found guilty in a completely discredited institution in a court in Guantanamo Bay, a court that's been struck down by the US civil court system. You know, whatever guilt he's been found, or whatever he has been found guilty of, does not dovetail with Australian law, and I don't think the government has any right to be denying him the proceeds from that book.
Josh, he's served time in Guantanamo Bay. Is this a other than normal case where maybe he should get to keep the proceeds of the book?
Look, under no circumstances should David Hicks profit from the proceeds of effectively of his crime, of which he was convicted, and he spent 7 years in imprisonment in relation to that. He admitted his own guilt. He was found, subsequently convicted, and he should not be allowed to benefit from that. So, my only point about the government has been, as George Brandis has pointed out, it's been slow to react. The book's been out for, I think, around a year, and we're only now seeing the government push this issue. So David Hicks has a lot to answer for, and I think the fact that he has now published this book, it's sold, some 30,000 copies, he should not be allowed to keep any proceeds from it.
Look, fair go, Josh. I mean, we've got a man here, regardless of what you think of David Hicks, he was subject to torture. He was found guilty in a court that, by any reasonable standards, has no credibility in Australia. If we're going to deny him proceeds from his book, then he needs to be tried in an Australian court, and he hasn't been, and there's no intention to.
But Andrew, why did he spend time in an Australian incarceration? Because he was effectively exchanged under an agreement with the United States on that basis that he was convicted for those 7 years.
That was a political deal. And that's another key point here. It's all about a discredited court, torture, and a political deal. I think at every turn there's a man who should not be losing the proceeds of that book.
Andrew, if I could just take this opportunity, given we've got you on, you've warned on several occasions that if the government doesn't progress poker machine reform, you'll withdraw your support, and if that means the end of the government, so be it. What would withdrawing your support look like? Would you move a motion of no confidence? Would you switch your support to the coalition? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, Lyndal, everyone knows the bottom line, and I don't need to repeat it. Nothing's changed, except that at every turn the government has appeared to do the right thing by me. Not only is the government keen to honour its agreement with me, I do believe that the government, and in particular Julia Gillard and Jenny Macklin, are keen to do something about problem gambling in Australia. But you
have made that threat, and I just wanted to clarify exactly what that would mean.
Well, I will tear up my agreement with Julia Gillard. It's simple as that, and then we'll be in uncharted waters, and we'll have to see where it goes from there. I don't think it's wise at this point in time to try and guess what those uncharted waters look like.
But Andrew, you will do that. But Andrew, you will do that if you don't get mandatory commitment, isn't that right? You will tear up that agreement.
If mandatory pre-commitment is not fitted to high-intensity machines in Australia,
yes,
I'll tear up that agreement.
Are there any circumstances under which you'd support the coalition forming government?
No, I don't want to speculate what I do after that. For a start, I don't know what Tony Abbott or the opposition leader at the time will do about that. I don't know whether they would move a no confidence motion or not. We don't know what the wording of that motion might be. I think it's a bit reckless to be trying to speculate. The only certainty at this stage is I have an agreement. The government is keen to honour that agreement. At every turn, the government is honouring that agreement, and I think the legislation to put mandatory pre-commitment on all high-intensity poker machines, and I would add to introduce $1 maximum bet low-intensity machines outside of mandatory pre-commitment, I have no reason to think that won't be realised, and that there won't be a need to tear up the agreement. And that's where we'll have to leave it. Josh Frydenberg and Andrew Wilke, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Lyndal. Thanks, Andrew.
Josh. Thanks, Lyndal.
And thank you for joining us on Capitol Hill. Join us at the same time tomorrow.